Zambia has a complex public procurement system, which of late has come under the spotlight due to various scandals. From undelivered goods to undervaluing of contracts and delivering of fake goods. All these have been topical and emotive in the court of public opinion. The Zambian taxpayer has been left wondering as to what has happened to its public procurement system. This is what has prompted the Consumer Unit and Trust Society, CUTS International, to commission this documentary to highlight the challenges of the public procurement system.
So we decided to undertake this documentary on public procurement because we thought that there's been a lot of speculation about Zambia's procurement system, whether it's issues of corruption, issues of lack of transparency and accountability, and we thought it would be good to get stakeholder voices, various stakeholder voices on the particular stakeholders that are involved in the procurement system process. So what we decided to do was to interview government stakeholders, private sector institutions, as well as cooperating partners such as the World Bank that are actively pushing for the improvement of Zambia's public procurement system. So we're doing this because we believe that together we can jointly improve the situation and also increase the level of transparency and accountability so at the end of the day, public procurement benefits Zambians and allows the government to achieve developmental goals such as poverty reduction.
The public sector in Zambia is composed of over 20 government ministries, each of which runs several departments and parastatal companies. Some of these entities run their separate procurement units, which are all regulated by the Zambia Public Procurement Authority, ZPPA.
So the institutions that are responsible for the governance, it's basically the authority, which is the Zambia Public Procurement Authority as a regulator. And then we've got various government sector institutions that we call generally the procuring entities. We have got over 507 public procuring entities. So in simple terms, it's the ZPPA and the public sector procuring entities. They're the ones that are responsible for the public procurement system.
Every year, each of these procurement entities make their procurement plans for the year. And it is the role of the ZPPA which is supposed to ensure that these procurement plans are followed and no irregularities are involved.
The Compliance Monitoring Division, there are inspectors that go to check on the procuring entities, whether they're ministries, parastatals, government, state-owned enterprises. Yes, we've got schedules where we go and inspect them. We go and do procurement audits, tender audits, contract monitoring audits. So we've got some scheduled inspection and auditing that we carry out, at least for most high-value, buying entities like, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Agriculture, Road Development Agency. At least we go to there and inspect them at least twice in a year to make sure that they're adhering to the public procurement legislation.
Even when the ZPPA finds queries, it has no teeth to bite. The authority is not mandated to punish or prosecute erring entities or procurement officers. This is how its sister institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission and the Drug Enforcement Commission take up the cases. For the SEC, its mandate is broader, but procurement is one of its main areas of investigations.
The number of cases that we are currently dealing with to do with procurement. We've had the case of Ronald Meleki, who was convicted for failure to declare interest. We've had cases of Fabian Mumba, the former PS, Northwestern Province. He was also convicted for failure to lay down Zambia Public Procurement Procedure Guidelines. We've had cases we've taken to court, some are on appeal. For example, the case of Sylvia Masebo. At the moment it's on appeal. So there are cases arising from there, and those most of them have been on the rise in terms of procurement. First of all, to effectively deal with the public procurement system, we have to start with the people that deal with the system itself. You can have perfect systems in place, but the people that deal with those systems, if they are not cut out from doing the wrong things, the systems will never yield the results that they anticipate. So for us to effectively deal with that, those people that are directly dealing with procurement, there must be stiffer penalties. For example, revocation of their licenses and mandatory sentences, so that the law deters would-be offenders.
The Auditor General is another institution which plays an oversight role in the procurement process. Annually, this institution publishes audit reports on all government accounts. Unfortunately, irregularities in the public procurement process features highly in its reports.
When you look at our reports, a number of irregularities have been raised in respect of public procurement. And some of these irregularities have caused huge losses to government. Maybe before I indicate the reaction that government has made to these particular findings, it should be important that maybe I can just give you a brief highlight of some of the findings that could have been raised under public procurement findings. One particular issue that I may draw your attention to is, for instance, we have had cases where a contract has been awarded and the terms of payment clearly outlined. For instance, the contract states that 10% advance payment shall be paid for probably the contractor to commence the discharge of works or manufacture of the particular goods that are being procured. And let's say, for instance, the 10% of these works, and these are huge amounts we are talking about. Let's assume the contract price is $30 million. 10% of that particular amount is $3 million. And the contract requires that 10% advance payment be made. There have been cases where the procuring entity may not be able to pay the whole sum of the 10%. They may probably, in this case, instead of paying $3 million, which is the 10% that is expected to be paid, they probably only pay $2 million. And it is not known when the balance of the 1 million is expected to be paid. And then the situation stands out that the payment may not be made in full, even to the tune of 2 years. Now, when you look at $2 million, in as far as the nation is concerned, going by the economic status of our country, $2 million is a huge amount of money. And this amount of money may be held by the contractor, but the contractor may not have been able to move on site because the 10% as agreed in the contract has not yet been made in full. Now, a question might be raised. Now, what is happening with this $2 million which has been paid as part of the advance payment, which is not in full?
Some of these irregularities in the Auditor General's reports include undelivered goods, which keep increasing every year.
2017, Zambia lost over 1 million kwacha in terms of undelivered services. The question is, what is happening if I'm awarded a contract to supply certain materials to, for example, a ministry, and I do not deliver? Are there no systems to ensure that either I'm sanctioned or I'm compelled to deliver? Secondly, in 2018, that figure shot up to 9 million. It increased by 8 million. In 2019, it shot up to 23 million. What does that tell you? A weak public procurement system necessitates, one, corruption, necessitates, two, the loss of public resources. And when we imagine how much 23 million can do, but also imagine the impact of 23 million worth of goods and services not delivered on the ministries or the government department that were intended to receive those materials and services. Of course, their service delivery is affected, but also the effect of inadequate materials, inadequate supplies in those government departments translates in that department failing to deliver effective services. So it's absolutely important that we safeguard systems that going into public procurement processes for one particular reason: one, to secure the resources, but also to ensure that intended beneficiaries from government departments, ministries, and agencies actually receive what they're supposed to receive. So a bad procurement system is a conduit, or it facilitates bad procurement practices. And there are a lot of examples we can give in the country.
In the procurement process, government departments make business with the private sector. And it is this interface which sometimes leads to corruption. In some cases, it is underpayment or lack of payment which becomes a concern.
So some of the challenges are that these contracts are usually big, they're huge, and you'll find that the government doesn't give you a down payment. So as a local supplier, then you have to source funds to then provide this. It's expected that you should have those funds quite all right by the government, but because the government has not been paying for quite some time for a number of procurements that they've done, it means that liquidity on local suppliers has been hampered. And so if the government doesn't give any sort of down payment, then it becomes difficult for suppliers to go ahead. And because of this debt that has accrued by the government on local suppliers, the challenge has been that local suppliers have not been forthcoming in the recent past. For SMEs, the biggest issue really is, as I have mentioned, the fact that they do not have the upfront cash that can allow them to provide these goods and services to government. And in the absence of this upfront cash, they are then tempted to be not supplying at the time when the government needs the goods, and this has disadvantaged them, because then government then prefers larger suppliers who can then put up this money or get a guarantee from the bank. And with SMEs, these guarantees from the banks don't come as easily as they would come from a larger supplier, and so they tend to be disadvantaged because of that. Well, with the CEC provisions, where there's citizenship empowerment, you do realize that has a certain kind of rating that allows for local participation to be undertaken. But the biggest challenge is that you need to be registered. And if you are not registered, even if you are able to supply, say I'm a local manufacturer, I'm able to supply, but if I do not have this registration, it means that I have to pass through an agent or someone who has that registration. And so that's where the biggest challenge has been, is that local manufacturers who are not registered then have to be supplying through agents. And then the agent takes a big cut out of this supply, which then hampers the ability of the local manufacturer to go ahead and supply to the government. So that's where the biggest challenge has been.
The role of the private sector in the public procurement system is very critical. Sometimes, the private sector underperforms, and this leads to audit queries.
From my experience, one of the major challenges that is obvious, it's well known, is an issue of payment to suppliers or contractors. That's a big issue. It can be underplayed, and it does affect, to a large extent, the capacity of a supplier or contractor to perform or deliver on a contract. Also we have known cases where, on the other hand, the public entity pays a supplier on time or a contractor on time, but then they fail to deliver because of their own incapacity or other reasons. Also, we have known of cases where a contractor or a supplier, probably because of lack of financial capacity or other issues, deliver substandard works, goods or services. So those are some of the challenges that you could talk about.
In times of crisis, the Zambian government approves emergency procurement plans. These are meant to buy urgent goods, which could not have been budgeted for in the current national budget. Using this option, the Ministry of Health procured condoms and other drugs, which were found to have been substandard, and this led to the infamous honeybee scandal, which led to dismissals of many officials in the ministry.
And probably being used by the contractor himself at no benefit to the country. Maybe 2-3 years down the line, you hear a situation that a contract has been terminated. Now, what happens with the 2 million that was paid as part of the advance payment, which was not in full? This creates a situation or an aspect where government now will have to start pursuing the contractor, which may not at all probably been raised. So in this particular case, matters of procurement have been a very big concern. Now, in most of these cases, when these particular findings, this being just one example, government has made different reactions. Some of the reactions that could have been made by government could be dismissals. In the event that the government concludes that this particular irregularity was caused deliberately by particular individuals, some of those individuals have been dismissed. In cases where probably further investigations are required by government, those particular investigations through the law enforcement agencies have been undertaken. I would give you an example. Recently, it was in the public domain on the issues regarding the procurement of drugs at Ministry of Health. It was public knowledge, those particular irregularities that were raised by the Auditor General and the respective action that the government took. Key to that, I think, is common knowledge by now. Some staff that were alleged to have been connected to that particular irregularity. Some of them were dismissed, some of them are still being prosecuted, some of them are still being investigated over that particular aspect. I would definitely also want to make mention that apart from just those kind of dismissals that may have been made, sometimes certain actions that would be required would just be mere administrative aspects in terms of probably just enhancing the control environment within a particular institution. So those are some of the actions that the government has undertaken in trying to respond to the findings raised by the Auditor General.
And this is not the only scandal under the emergency procurement system. Currently, the investigating wings are probing the procurement and utilization of donated funds for the fight against the coronavirus.
We need to find a way, or we need to categorize what is an emergency procurement, and I think I will relate it to the recent Interim Auditor General's report, which showed a lot of procurement corruption in how COVID-19 PPEs were procured. People took advantage of the emergency of procuring those things, so they ended up pocketing money. So if you have a system, or if you have a law that will clearly define what an emergency procurement is and what procedure should be followed, I think that would really help us. And what a long-term procurement is, what the time frame is, that would really be helpful. What people want to do is first pocket money rather than buy things that are of good quality. I will give an example. The recent scandal of the honeybee issue, we have seen that there were defective drugs that were bought, but a lot of money was spent in that at the expense of people. and drugs. So that's the problem with when you have a bad public procurement system. I would say if you have an open procurement system, I think that would promote accountability and transparency. Apart from that, I think we already have the e-procurement system that government is using, but I believe not all procurement entities are using that. So I believe if you have that rolled out to all the procurement entities, I believe that would promote transparency and accountability.
But what can be done to clean up the public procurement system?
Because it is evident that the legal framework has loopholes which can facilitate spending agencies to procure goods and services at exorbitant prices. One of the things that we've also observed is that it's like the penalties in the law are not strong enough to encourage people to do things the right way. It's like, you know, in their weak penalties, someone might not mind going to jail for, 6 months or whatever amount of time if they know that they're going to benefit a 50 million kwacha. So there's need for very strong penalties, and this can only be facilitated through a strong legal framework, a framework that promotes transparency and accountability. We need to know who's getting these big contracts. We need to know who's supplying us with the key medical supplies. We need to know who's supplying our children with textbooks, for instance, because sometimes we hear speculation that these are actually, that we're buying textbooks that are actually donated, that are not for sale. You know, all this comes back to our procurement system. A lot of corruption. Corruption needs to be dealt with. This is why we've particularly also involved Anti-Corruption Commission to be part of this documentary, so that they can also explain how they're going to deal with the various corruption issues going forward and how they've been dealing with them in the past. Lastly, we're also of the view that the government needs to foster engagement of citizens and civil society organizations in procurement oversight. I think there's very weak monitoring of public procurement contracts. If it's not for a journalist coming out to point out and say there are issues here with the way this thing was procured and it can harm citizens, then there might not be any action being taken. So monitoring needs to be strengthened. Maybe the government does not have all the capacity to monitor, so they can involve civil society organizations, they can also involve the media, just so that suppliers, the private sector does the right thing and supplies the right goods to the general public.
Others feel the approach must be with the procurement officers who handle this procurement process.
The Anti-Corruption Act, which is the principal legislation in the fight against corruption, mandates for the establishment of integrity committees in both public and private institutions. So through the establishment of integrity committees in public institutions, these integrity committees are mandated with the responsibility to carry out the prevention of corruption within the sphere of control. So once they are established in these public institutions, the integrity committees are there to strengthen the systems, and one of those systems are procurement systems. So the integrity committee will come up with or they develop certain best practice documents, and those will include maybe the code of ethics, the conflict of interest declaration procedures, the gift policies. So all those policies are aimed at giving guidelines to members of staff within those institutions on how they need to carry out their work with integrity and also with transparency. So once those best practice documents or those documents that I've mentioned are developed, there's need for sensitization. So the integrity committee will be there to ensure that they facilitate for the sensitization, and also there's need to ensure that there's compliance to what has been put in place. Maybe I should also that there's what the integrity committee does also is to develop service charters, mainly to give information on the services that an institution is offering. So through that, the institutions and the public procurement entities are catered for.
The Zambia Public Procurement Authority occasionally educates procurement entities to adhere to ethical benchmarks set for procurement officers.
So in this Amendment Act number 15, there's a clause which can give us powers as ZPPA to discipline procuring entities, even public officers, within a procuring entity, whether they're controlling officers or they're members of the procurement committee or whoever was involved in the management of that procurement proceeding. If they breach the Public Procurement Act, we invoke some section in our Act where we can sanction them. We can, for instance, recommend that they be, summarily be dismissed, or we can recommend that we transfer them from one procuring entity to another procuring entity. Or we can recommend to say, as ZPPA, we don't have powers to prosecute them in the courts of law. We can recommend that Anti-Corruption Commission, Drug Enforcement Commission, National Prosecutions Authority, we've got MOUs with all these prosecution institutions. They can be taken to the courts of law and they can be prosecuted for breaching or not adhering to the Public Procurement Act and its regulations.
One innovation the Zambian government has introduced is e-procurement. This online system of purchasing goods and services is meant to reduce the interface between procurement officers in the public sector and suppliers.
Then we have the e-procurement, which is coming into law. It's a good move in that the procurement officers will not have to handle the paperwork. All of it will be on the system. And then the following also would help. You need to computerize the store's functions, and create database for institutions, establish a stock control section and database for institutions' requirements to determine timelines and qualities.
But what is the role of the civil society in the fight for a better procurement process? In April 2021, CATS International held a number of engagements aimed at raising awareness on public procurement. At a breakfast meeting in Lusaka, CATS was joined by Oxfam, ActionAid, and other CSOs on raising concern on the state of Zambia's procurement process.
According to research conducted by the Consumer Unity and Trust Society, the procurement process is marked by significant departures from competitive bidding, which is seen through the absence of standard contracts and tender documents, absence of public access to tender documents and pre-qualifying criteria, short timelines, and no enforced publishing of tender results. Therefore, there's urgent need for the government to follow transparent, open procurement procedures that are aimed at ensuring fair conditions of competition for suppliers. Secondly, procurement of goods and services at exorbitant prices. The government procuring goods and services at exorbitant prices above the market value implies that despite adhering to the correct procurement procedure in accordance with the law, goods and services are being procured at highly inflated prices which do not reflect value for money. Consequently, the inflation of prices by suppliers deprives the country of resources which could be directed to other programs and projects that require government funding. Thirdly, the limited legal framework. Despite the various laws and regulations that lead the procurement system in Zambia, the system needs keen policy coherence, which is critical in ensuring the sound management of public finances while maximizing impact for consumers or Zambian citizens.
One of the things that procurement decisions has is that it affects future planning and resource allocation. Because if today we make procurement based on inflated figures, when we are planning in the next year, Parliament and all ministries are planning on unreliable estimates. And this then affects the quality of service that citizens are able to access. This can also be seen in the Auditor General's report on COVID-19 resources, where we see that overcommitments of close to about 63 million are actually seen in that report, meaning that if our procurement processes were strengthened or were solid, we would see that that situation would not actually happen. So as ACA, we also would like to join CATS, TIZ and Oxfam to emphasize the need for effectiveness, efficiency and value for money in all procurement decisions made by the state.
I think one of the things that we have seen as civil society organizations over the years is that there does not seem to be an urge or a desire to bring to book people that are mentioned, or officials or public officials that are mentioned in reports such as the Auditor General's report, for example. I think year in and year out, we see specific officials being mentioned in the Auditor General's report, but because nothing gets done about it, what we have seen is that there has been a cycle of impunity that just goes on and on and on. So we would like to really reiterate our call, and this is a call that we've made in previous contexts, that the government really should begin to take punitive action, or the authorities should begin to take punitive action against public officials that are cited in reports such as the Auditor General's report. Taking such decisive action will not only show government's actualization of its commitment to address corruption, but it will also put a stop to the impunity that has taken root within our public procurement system. So really it's just to re-emphasize the fact that when officials are mentioned as having participated in procurement anomalies, I think we need to begin to see more of punitive action being taken in order to set an example and show that our commitment to address issues of corruption within our procurement system is not just verbal, but is actually something that we are putting to practice in terms of the action.
When you have a procurement system generally that is highly centralized and very concentrated, which is what we are experiencing right now in Zambia, it follows that you are likely to have much weaker system strengthening at subnational level. What I mean by this is that public procurement is not just a factor of central government in terms of ministries that are in Lusaka, and procurement happens at the whole range of how government is set up. So you find that we have a lot of problems that have also been highlighted by the Auditor General. As you know, they decided to do an audit of subnational institutions, just like parastatals. And you find that we have unique problems that have to do with government parastatals and councils. So what that means is that as part of the strengthening of the law, we need ZPPA to be much more independent, to be much stronger, even in terms of its financing, so that it is able to provide and facilitate for the implementation of those standards. The templates that Ms. Muyinda spoke about that need to be followed when doing procurement planning by government entities, when following through tender procedures, ZPPA has to have the capacity to do that. So what I'm saying is that there is need to put more effort and more resources in bolstering the capacity of ZPPA to be able to facilitate for the implementation of these standards for subnational entities. By this I'm talking about the councils, and for parastatals. For councils it is also important, because imagine if there is a road that has to be done in Porokoso, and Porokoso as a council, they have the capacity to do that road. If they did that road in Porokoso using local resources, using the sand and everything that is there in Porokoso, you are making sure that there are more jobs that are being generated in Porokoso, local suppliers are benefiting there, and it will end up being lower in terms of cost if it is done right there in Porokoso, as opposed to RDA coming from Lusaka to go and do that road. But for the council in Porokoso to do that, it needed to have received this kind of support I'm talking about from ZPPA. Another point that I want to just speak about briefly is around procurement is presided over by individuals, public officials especially. So whereas you have a system that should control procurement, you also have individuals who have to have integrity. So there is the integrity of systems, there is also the integrity of the individuals that are our public officials, our civil servants. So here, the recommendation that we can make is for individuals to be patriotic, to know that the money that they're presiding over is hard-earned money that is very hard to come by. We have a budget in 2021, for example, which is almost taken over by only two things. That is debt servicing and meeting the constitutional obligations of the statutory obligations of paying for salaries, for example. So one has to have the conscience to know that if I don't apply this money properly, the Zambian citizen is going to suffer because the state doesn't have enough money in the first place. So here, the recommendation we could make is to try and strengthen the integrity committees that are in some of our public institutions so that they can help to increase the integrity of our officials. Lastly, when you ask the question, is transparency attainable in Zambia? I think it is attainable if some of the things we have proposed in the statement can be looked at, particularly around public disclosure. When you look at the 2020 Act, it's a very progressive act. But then you see that it...
And as civil society organizations, we have collaborated numerous times on national development projects, and we are pleased to continue cooperating to ensure various economic developments trickle down to benefit the ordinary Zambians at the end of the day. So based on this, given this background, today we have collaborated to address our concerns on public procurement in Zambia. We are happy that the government has demonstrated political will to continuously improve our public procurement systems, which is highly commendable. By this, we're making reference to the revision of the Public Procurement Act of 2008, which has been repealed and replaced by the Public Procurement Act number 8 of 2020. And it is expected to result in better public spending, which should ultimately benefit Zambians. Now, despite this, we are of the view that Zambia can make its public procurement system much more efficient to drive economic growth and improve socio-economic welfare. As many of you know, public procurement serves as a significant policy instrument that can provide quality public service delivery, creating fiscal space and stimulating private sector growth. A well-performing public procurement system increases citizens' confidence in government, promotes private sector competitiveness, and levels the playing field for small and medium-sized businesses. The procurement process has unfortunately been comprised by highly inflated spending, high levels of corruption, and many other inefficiencies. This has led to Zambia losing significant amounts of money due to bad procurement practices. The latest Auditor General's report, for instance, shows that over 23.5 million kwacha was lost due to the non-delivery of materials. This wastage is causing the government treasury and making it more difficult for the country to achieve its development goals if funds are not translating to quality service provision. If this 23.5 million kwacha was channeled to other sectors in the economy, this would have resulted in development. This would have resulted in improved national development goals.
Through this spirited fight by the civil society, the Zambian government has responded positively to the need for a better procurement system. On 16th March 2021, the Minister of Finance issued a commencement order for the Public Procurement Act of 2020. This act brings progressive issues such as the electronic procurement system, increased citizen participation in the public procurement process, publication of quarterly market prices, and capping of contract variation of 25% of the contract price. All this has been achieved with a spirited fight by the Zambian CSOs, led by CATS International through its Lusaka office.